Welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Will the development of advanced technology lead to the next step in the course of human evolution? Or will it serve to tear society completely apart? In this installment of Nightmare Masterclass, I'm analyzing the classic 1968 science fiction epic, 2001: A Space Odyssey. It shouldn't be controversial to say that 2001 is one of the greatest science fiction films of all time. It may well be one of the greatest films of all time. Directed by Stanley Kubrick, 2001 follows a space mission to the planet Jupiter. Though, of course, that pithy one-line summary can't possibly capture the cinematic journey that is 2001. At nearly 2.5 hours long, 2001 is a behemoth, but the film is notably lacking in dialogue. It actually has just around 40 minutes worth of it. Instead of the expository dialogue we've grown accustomed to in your run-of-the-mill sci-fi movies, we're treated to the height of both spectacle and, yes, terror in this cinematic experience. Kubrick is known for the breathtaking amount of detail in his films, and that is certainly the case with 2001. The film is undeniably beautiful, especially in light of the time in which it was created. We have postulated various interpretations of the movie. There are some rather ominous themes, apparently.